So, one of the more frequently asked questions I've received over the past several days is why is it that the NBA scores are so ridiculously high? And why is it that the stat lines are absurd? And why are there so many players who are scoring 30, 40, 50 points more consistently? And because of these questions, along with the fact that I've personally received people come up to me and ask me this exact same question, I decided to make a video explaining what's going on in the NBA. Because it is true that the NBA is going through an extreme transformative phase, and a simple explanation to this is pace. Pace is one of the more overlooked factors when it comes to interpreting statistics throughout league's history. When it comes to pace, or the amount of possessions that happen within a game, we have seen a significant change within the last 20 years, especially throughout the 90s and the 2000s, and ever since the 2010 season until now, it has slowly been back on the increase. And as of right now, the pace in the league, or again, how many possessions are happening within the NBA game, is roughly around 101 to 102. To put that in better context, the pace over the past 20 years has been lower than 95, and this is the highest pace that we have seen since the 1985-86 season. However, pace and possessions, really, they're not the best way to measure how many points a team may score within a game, largely because every possession does not conclude with a shot attempt due to turnovers. So when it comes to how many points a team or a player is scoring on a game-to-game basis, the best way to look at this is field goal attempts, or how many shots are attempted within a game. As of right now, it's roughly around 90 shot attempts per game. To put this into context, this is literally the highest it has been since the 1979-1980 season, and because of this, as we all know, more shots that are attempted, that means that there's more shots that are made, and with more made shots, that means that there's going to be more points that are scored, not only on an individual basis, but also through teams as well. But with that being said, we also have to keep in mind how many three-pointers are being made as well. So coincidentally enough, the NBA actually introduced the three-point line in the 1979-1980 season, and as we all are aware, there has been a slow increase on the amount of three-pointers that have been attempted on a game-to-game basis, excluding the handful of seasons when the NBA decided to move the three-point line closer to the basket. But outside of that, the increase has been slow and steady. But oddly enough, since the 2012 season, and largely due to the fact that analytics has taken over a huge portion of how many people interpret the NBA, there has been a significant jump on how many three-pointers are attempted on a year-to-year basis. As of right now, and again, I know it's only 2 weeks into the regular season, we are at 31 attempts per game. That is pretty remarkable when you start to think about it. So because of this, even though yes, this is the highest shot attempts that we have seen since the 1979-1980 season, that doesn't mean that's going to be the same amount of points that are scored, largely because the three-point line plays a way heavier role in today's NBA than it's ever had. Because of this, the amount of points that were scored in the 1979-1980 season is roughly around 109 points. However, the amount of points that are scored on average in today's NBA is roughly around 112. To put that into context, this is the highest points per game the NBA has seen since the 1970-1971 season. Now let's explain why this is happening in the NBA. Many people have certain theories, and some of them are extremely interesting. However, my beliefs are the reason why we see an increase in pace and a change in playing style is directly correlated to the rules and the personnel that's on the floor for majority of teams in the NBA, which is something that historically has always dictated the way the NBA is being played during a stretch of years. But before we get into today's NBA, we have to kind of go back and look at what happened in the 90s and the 2000s, because when you look at the field goal attempted graph that I showed you earlier, you clearly see there is a pretty sharp decline on the amount of field goals that were attempted during this stretch of 10 to 15 years, as well as the pace as well. Now, why is this? Many people have different arguments, but again, I believe it has a lot to do with the rules and the personnel that was featured throughout this time period. Now, throughout the 90s, as many people know, you had illegal defense, which meant that you couldn't play zone defense, which meant that you couldn't help your teammate defensively unless you were fully committed to double teaming the opposing player, which eventually meant that teams were able to manipulate the system offensively, and it heavily promoted isolation play. More isolation play means that it's a slower pace, which means that there are fewer possessions, which means there are fewer opportunities to score, which means that there will be a lower score during this stretch of years, which gave a massive advantage to some of the more dominant big men during the 90s because they could just post up, isolate, and get better looks than they may have been able to get during the 2000s. And the reason why I say during the 2000s is because during the 2000s, that's when they reintroduced zone defense and they eliminated illegal defense. Now, here's the problem though. During the 2000s, because you had so many teams that were built through a traditional sense with a power forward and center who could not space out the floor, defenses during the early to mid 2000s were almost at an all-time high. And the same thing can be said with a lot of defenses during the 90s as well. So during the 90s and the 2000s, due to just rules and personnel, you had teams that were more defensive oriented and were able to hold their opponent to fewer than 90 or even 80 points on a consistent basis. But how did that get us to where we are in today's league? Well, because of zone defense that immediately forced teams to organize offense differently. So much so that, as we all are aware, the power forward position has changed rather significantly over the past 5 to 10 years. So much so that more teams feel more comfortable playing certain small forwards at the power forward position, largely due to the amount of spacing that they will be able to gain with a more perimeter oriented lineup with the power forward spaced all the way to the 3-point line. Because of this, that means that there are more perimeter oriented players on the floor at all times, which means that there are more likely more athletic players on the floor as well, which would immediately translate to more fast breaks, more possessions, more opportunities to score, which again means that there will be more points scored in an NBA game. And with there being more emphasis on the 3-point line, which again would stretch the defense out, which would prevent teams from playing zone defense, it just makes it easier for teams to score all in all, which again would increase the amount of points that are scored on a game-to-game basis. So to wrap up this video, what does this mean? Well, for one, for people out there who believe that this is just a trend or a fad and it's something that will eventually change, I don't necessarily believe that's true. Sure, maybe somewhere down the line possibly, but in the near future, this is just how the NBA will be played moving forward. Again, if you go back to the graph that I showed you, you can clearly see the NBA has been trending in this direction for the past several years now, and to ignore that will just be ignorant. Another thing that you must acknowledge is that while participating in the NBA community, we must reevaluate certain statistical achievements. For example, when it comes to teams allowing a certain amount of points, which is something that I'm constantly hearing within the NBA community, no, it does not mean that they're playing bad defense when they're allowing their opponent to score 110 to 112 points, when that's roughly around the league average. And finally, and probably the biggest reason why I wanted to make this video, is because it's just giving us another reason to utilize context when we're talking about certain players in a historic aspect. I've been watching the NBA pretty carefully well over a decade at this point, and been in the NBA community 2 for 3 years now. And the one thing that is completely irritating is how so many people fail to acknowledge that context, the era in which you played in, the pace in which you played at, positions, etc., play a major role on the type of stat lines that you record on a night-to-night basis. And what makes it even more crazier is when it comes to players who played in the 60s, 70s, and sometimes even the 80s, there are a group of people who are quick to put an asterisk next to their stat lines, and rightfully so. They played at a ridiculous pace with more possessions, so obviously statistically they would have numbers that are absurd. But again, like I just showed you earlier, if the pace over the last 3 years is more similar to the style of play and pace that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and even the early 80s, why would you compare statistically what a player is doing now to what a player did in the 90s or the 2000s, when historically that was the slowest basketball we had ever seen? So those are just my thoughts. Please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. And also let me know if you enjoy this style of basketball being played, because personally, I do myself. And also make sure you hit the subscribe button, notification bell, and I will see you all next time. Peace.